She walked down that aisle believing she had finally won. Dress perfect. Flowers perfect. Every person she had ever wanted to impress seated in that church, watching her like she was the most important woman in the world. And for one brief golden moment, she was. She didn't know that the man standing at the end of that aisle had spent the previous night reading a file that changed everything he thought he knew about her. She didn't know that while she was getting her hair pinned and her makeup set and her veil adjusted by hands that kept trembling with excitement, he was sitting alone in a dark room, making a decision that had nothing to do with love. She thought she had finally escaped the life that had been quietly suffocating her for years. She had no idea she was walking straight into the moment that would cost her everything she had traded that life away for. 24 hours before the wedding, her fiancé found out who she really was, what she had really done, what she had never once mentioned across months of dinners and conversations and quiet mornings that felt like the beginning of something real. And instead of calling it off behind closed doors, instead of handling it privately, cleanly, without an audience, he made a different choice entirely. He showed up. He stood at that altar. He let her walk all the way down. And then he spoke. What he said, in front of hundreds of people in a church full of flowers and candles and people who had dressed up and travelled and cried happy tears just watching her come through those doors, wasn't a breakdown. It wasn't revenge in any recognizable shape. It wasn't shouting or accusations or the kind of public collapse you brace yourself for. It was something far quieter, far more deliberate, and somehow because of that, far more devastating than anything loud could have ever been. If you have ever watched someone choose a fantasy over the real thing, over the people who needed them, over the love that wasn't glamorous but was genuine, then what happens in this story is going to feel uncomfortably familiar. Stay with me. Every piece of this matters. And before we go any further, if you are the kind of person who needs to know how a story ends before you can breathe again, if you are the kind of person who finds a story and can't put it down until it's finished, subscribe to City of Tales right now, because we don't do halfway here. We don't leave you hanging without a reason. And the next story we have lined up? It might be the one that finds you at exactly the right moment. Now let's go back to the beginning. Because to understand what happened in that church, you have to understand what happened long before Ethan Caldwell ever existed in Danielle Carter's world. You have to understand the life she was living before she decided it wasn't enough. You have to understand the woman she was before she became the woman who would stand at that altar and feel the ground fall out from underneath her. Her name was Danielle Carter. And from the outside, from the careful, curated outside that most people only ever get to see, her life in a modest neighborhood on the southwest side of Houston looked exactly like what you were supposed to want. A house with a yard, as two kids with good manners and full backpacks and school schedules pinned to the refrigerator. A husband who came home every night, not late, not drunk, not carrying the weight of something shameful, just home. Reliable as a clock, steady as concrete. She had built that life with Marcus Carter starting from almost nothing. They had met in their mid-20s, her working 2 jobs while finishing a business degree, him grinding through overnight shifts at a logistics company while taking community college classes on the side. They were young and tired and completely in love in the way that only people who have nothing but each other can be. Their first apartment was the kind of place where you learn that love is less about candles and more about who takes the trash out without being asked. The walls were thin. The heat barely worked in January. The neighbors above them argued about things that had no resolution, but they laughed in that apartment. A lot. They cooked together in a kitchen that was barely big enough for 2 people to stand in simultaneously. They had inside jokes that started there and lasted years. They made plans, real ones, the kind you write down and tape to the wall because writing them down makes them feel possible. Marcus wanted to own something, a business, a piece of something real that was his. Danielle wanted to build a brand, something creative and hers. A space in the world that had her name on it. They were going to do it together. That was always the plan. Their daughter Imani arrived first, then their son, Jordan, 18 months later. And the way that happens with two people who love each other, but are also completely overwhelmed and underfunded, and trying to raise two small humans on schedules that don't line up, and sleep that doesn't come. The plan got pushed to the side, not abandoned, just postponed. Except postponed became a year, then 2, then 5, and somewhere in those years of doing what needed to be done, of paying what needed to be paid, of holding everything together with whatever was left after work and school pickups and pediatrician appointments and grocery runs and all the 10,000 invisible tasks that make up a functioning life, somewhere in all of that, they stopped talking about the plans. And then they stopped talking about much of anything at all. This is the part that's important to understand, because it's easy to hear a story like this and draw clean lines, to decide who the villain is early and hold on to that. But the truth is almost always messier than that. Marcus wasn't neglectful in any dramatic way. He didn't disappear. He didn't stop trying. He was just tired. Deeply, structurally, chronically tired in the way that happens to people who carry more than they should for longer than they planned. He worked long hours because the bills were real. He came home and helped with the kids because he was a present father, and that mattered to him in his bones. But somewhere in the execution of all that responsibility, he lost the thread of his wife. Not deliberately, not carelessly. The way you lose something small in a big move, not because you meant to leave it behind, but because there was too much to carry and your hands were already full. Danielle felt it happening. She felt herself becoming background. Not invisible in a way Marcus would have recognized if you pointed it out to him. He would have been genuinely hurt to hear her describe it that way. He still thought of her. Still noticed when she seemed off, still asked, occasionally, but if she was okay. But asking if someone is okay once a week, in a distracted voice while scrolling through your phone after the kids are down, that's not the same as being seen. And Danielle knew the difference. She had felt the difference once in the beginning, and the gap between then and now had become something she couldn't stop measuring. She started doing what people do when their inner life has no outlet. She filled the space with other things. She joined a gym she rarely used but liked having access to. She started taking long drives on Sunday mornings before the house woke up, just to have 30 minutes that belonged entirely to her. She started dressing for herself again, not for occasions, just for the Tuesday afternoon Target run. Because something about looking intentional on the outside made the inside feel less formless. And she started saying yes to things she would have previously said no to. Which is how she ended up at a charity gala on a Thursday night in a dress she almost didn't buy, with a friend who promised that the food would be good and the wine would be free, and that sometimes you just needed to be somewhere that wasn't your own living room. She almost didn't go. That detail will matter to her later, in the way that small decisions always matter in retrospect, once you can see where they led. The gala was for a children's literacy foundation, held in one of those downtown Houston venues that made you feel like you'd accidentally walked into a life you weren't supposed to have access to. High ceilings, soft lighting, the kind of floral arrangements that cost more than a car payment. Danielle didn't know anyone except her friend, who almost immediately got pulled into a conversation with someone she vaguely knew from work and kept mouthing sorry across the room in Danielle's direction. So Danielle stood with a glass of wine near a window and looked out at the city below and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Interesting. She felt interesting to herself, like maybe she was a person with a story worth telling, or standing in a place that rewarded people for being worth paying attention to. That was the exact moment Ethan Caldwell walked over. He didn't use a line, he didn't perform. He stood next to her, looked out at the same view and said, "You look like you're somewhere else entirely." She turned and looked at him, tall, salt and pepper at the temples in a way that read as distinguished rather than tired. A suit that fit the way suits only fit when someone has decided that fit is non-negotiable. late 40s or early 50s, though he carried it in a way that made the number irrelevant. And eyes that were doing something unusual. They were paying attention. Not to the room, not to the event, not to whoever was most important to be seen talking to her. "Maybe I am," she said. "Where?" he asked. And she paused, because it was such a simple question, and the honest answer was nowhere she could explain to a stranger, and that pause made him smile in a way that told her he wasn't a stranger to complicated answers. That first conversation lasted maybe 12 minutes before they were separated by the natural movement of the room. But Ethan found her once more before the night was over, handed her a card that had only his name and a number on it, and said, "If you want to finish the thought," she told herself she wouldn't call. She called. Their second conversation happened 4 days later at a coffee place she picked because it was nowhere near her neighborhood. It lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. She knew because she kept glancing at the time in mild panic every 20 minutes and then forgetting to actually leave. He asked about her. Not in the polite, shallow way that most conversations use questions as a formality. He asked in the way that told her he was filing the answers away somewhere, that they were landing somewhere real in him. He asked about what she had wanted to be before life made other decisions for her. He asked about her kids. Not out of obligation, but out of what seemed like genuine curiosity about who she was as a mother, as a person who had made choices. He asked about her marriage in a way that wasn't invasive, but wasn't avoidant either, just honest. He said, "Are you happy?" Directly, simply. And she sat with the question for long enough that they both had the answer before she spoke it. "I'm not sure I remember what that looks like," she said. He nodded like that made complete sense. Like it was one of the most understandable things he had ever heard. And something in Danielle, something that had been held at a certain careful tension for years, let go a fraction. By the third time they were together, she had already started doing something she couldn't quite name, and didn't examine too closely. She had started imagining, not planning. She wasn't that far gone yet, or so she told herself, just imagining what a different version of her life might look like, what it might feel like to be chosen, deliberately, by someone who had options, what it might feel like to be the thing someone reached for. Ethan moved carefully. He didn't push. He didn't rush. He seemed to understand instinctively that Danielle wasn't someone you chased. She was someone you created the conditions for. And so he created conditions. Yet he invited her to things. Never pressure, always with a clear exit if she needed one. A gallery opening. A private dinner with a small group of his business associates, where she was treated not as someone's wife but as herself, as a person whose opinions were solicited and remembered. A weekend event in San Antonio that she declined twice and then ultimately attended, telling Marcus she was going with her friend, which was partially true in the sense that she had asked her friend to cover for her. And her friend had agreed out of something between loyalty and alarm. And slowly, the world Ethan occupied began to feel more real to Danielle than the one she went home to. Not because Ethan's world was better in any objective sense, though it was more comfortable, more spacious, as more insulated from the particular grind that had worn her down, but because in that world she was different, or rather, she was a version of herself she liked more, lighter, more present, less invisible. She started making comparisons she knew weren't fair. Ethan always had time for her. Marcus was always stretched thin. Ethan remembered everything she told him. Marcus had started answering her mid-sentence without having heard the beginning. Ethan took her places that felt like proof that the world was bigger than her zip code. Marcus's idea of a date night had become takeout on the couch after the kids were in bed. She knew somewhere in the part of her that was still being honest with itself that she was comparing a marriage, with all its accumulated exhaustion and real-life weight, to a courtship that had never yet had to survive anything hard. She knew that, and she chose to keep going anyway. The conversation with Marcus, if you could call it that, happened on a Tuesday evening when the kids were at her mother's. She had planned to be gentle. She had planned to explain herself in a way that was fair, that acknowledged her own part in where they had ended up, that didn't make him feel like the villain of a story he hadn't known was being written. She managed about half of that, because Marcus's face when he understood what she was saying, not just that she was unhappy, not just that she needed space, but that she was leaving, that she had already made her decision, that there was someone else. That face broke something in the room that she hadn't known was fragile. He didn't yell. That surprised her. He just sat down. Very slowly, like his legs had made an independent decision about what they could hold. "The kids," he said. It wasn't a question. "You'll be here," she said. "They have you." He looked at her for a long time after that, like he was trying to memorize her, or trying to understand her, or trying to locate the woman he had built his entire adult life next to in the face of the woman currently sitting across from him. He didn't find her. Or maybe he did, and that was the part that hurt more. Danielle left within the week. She told herself it was better this way, clean, no extended unraveling, no years of trying to fix what she believed was unfixable. As she had friends who had spent decades in the slow death of a marriage that was already over, and she had always privately thought, "Not me. When I know, I'll go," she knew. She went. What she did not allow herself to look at directly was the door she closed on Imani and Jordan. The way her daughter pressed her face against the window the morning the car pulled away. The way her son, who was 7 and still young enough to believe his mother would have a good reason for whatever she did, kept saying, "But when are you coming back?" With a patience that was somehow worse than anger. She told them she loved them. She told them she would see them soon. She made those statements without a clear plan for how either of them was going to be true in the way they needed to be. And then she drove toward the life she had decided she deserved. As life with Ethan was everything the fantasy had promised. That's the part people skip over when they tell stories like this one. The part where it's actually good, where the thing you chased turns out to be real in many of the ways you hoped. Where you wake up in a bedroom that gets real morning light and someone brings you coffee and asks what you feel like doing with your Saturday and means it as a genuine question. Danielle travelled to places she had only seen in the kind of content you watch when you're trying to imagine your way out of your own life. She had dinner in cities she'd never been to. She wore things she would have considered impractical 6 months earlier. Not because Ethan pushed her toward them, but because she had the space now to dress like the version of herself she had always held at a slight distance. She laughed differently, more freely, less like someone managing the sound of it. And Ethan was consistent in the way that men with stability often are. He wasn't performing. He genuinely liked her. He was attentive without being suffocating. He had opinions and stated them, but held space for hers. He made her feel capable and chosen and worth the effort. And those feelings, when you have been running on empty for years, are not small things. She called the kids. Twice a week at first, then once a week. Then, whenever she could manage it without it wrecking the interior equilibrium she was working so hard to maintain. She told herself she was still their mother. She told herself physical distance wasn't the same as emotional absence. She half believed it. But the proposal came on an ordinary evening. They were at his home in River Oaks. No candles, no elaborate staging. Just Ethan sitting across from her at the kitchen island after dinner. A ring set quietly on the counter between them, saying, "I want to do this properly if you're willing." It wasn't a dramatic ask. It was a calm one. She said yes. And the planning began. The wedding was set for the first Saturday in April. The venue was a historic estate outside the city, the kind of place with iron gates and magnolia trees and a chapel that had stood for 100 years and seen the kind of ceremonies that people commissioned oil paintings of afterward. 400 guests. A florist who was flown in from New York. A dress that required 3 fittings and a 4th one just because Danielle kept wanting to look at it. She stood in front of the mirror at that 4th fitting and looked at herself for a long time. She looked like everything she had wanted to be. She looked like a rival. She also looked, if you caught her in the wrong 3 seconds, like someone who was holding their breath. Because sometimes, in the in-between moments, the ones that slipped through before she could manage them, she thought about the people she had left behind in order to get here. Specifically, she thought about Imani's voice on the phone, how it had started to take on a careful quality, the way children's voices go when they're old enough to understand that something between them and a parent is fragile, and they have started choosing their words around that fragility. How her daughter had stopped saying, "I miss you," the way she used to say it, with urgency and accusation, and had started saying it softly, like a statement of fact with nowhere left to go. She thought about Jordan drawing her a picture and mailing it to an address he had gotten from his grandmother. A drawing of 4 people holding hands labelled, in the spelling of a 7-year-old who was trying hard, "Our family." She had kept that drawing. It was in a box she didn't open. She thought about Marcus, not with romantic longing, not even with guilt exactly, but with a specific kind of sorrow that comes from knowing that you were the cause of a wound in someone who didn't deserve to be wounded. She thought about all of it for the length of a few unguarded moments, and then she put it away, because regret was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. There was a wedding in 3 weeks. There were seating charts and menu confirmations and a rehearsal dinner. Her future mother-in-law was coordinating with the precision of someone who did not believe in delegation. Life was moving forward. That was what she had chosen. That was what mattered. Ethan had always been methodical. It was the quality that made him successful. Not just the intelligence, not just the appetite for work, but the specific discipline of not building anything on a foundation he hadn't personally inspected. He had lost money once, early in his career, by trusting a partnership he hadn't properly vetted. And that lesson had calcified into habit over the following decades. He checked, he verified, he trusted people and also made sure the people he trusted were who they presented themselves to be. With Danielle, there was nothing specific that alarmed him, just something small and unresolved. A story that had edges he couldn't quite smooth out. The way she talked about her children, never for very long, always with a pivot, always with just enough to acknowledge they existed without ever landing in the details. The way the subject of her marriage came up only in the broadest strokes. It didn't work. We grew in different directions. With none of the specific texture that people usually carry when they talk about something that was once the center of their life. He wasn't suspicious, exactly. He was thorough. So 4 months before the wedding, he made a quiet call to a firm he had used before for due diligence on business matters, and he asked them to do what they did. He told himself it was precautionary, that he expected to find nothing significant, that he would feel slightly foolish when the clean report came back and he would close the file and never mention it to anyone. The report that came back was not clean. He sat in his study on a Friday night, a glass of bourbon untouched on the desk beside him, and he read through what they had found. Not quickly, carefully. The way you read something when you are hoping that if you go slowly enough, the words will rearrange themselves into something less than what they appear to be on first pass. They didn't rearrange. Danielle hadn't just left a marriage. She had left a marriage with 2 young children in it. Children she had not fought for custody of, had not made arrangements to co-parent in any structured way, had not been consistently present for in the months since her departure. 2 children who were, according to everything in that file, being raised entirely by their father. 2 children who had not seen their mother in person in over 4 months, whose communication with her was sporadic and, from what the investigator could establish, initiated more often by the children than by Danielle. He read about Imani, 9 years old, made honor roll the semester after her mother left. Her teacher had noted in a parent conference, a conference attended only by Marcus, that Imani had become quieter, more self-contained, that she was performing well academically, but that there was a watchfulness about her now that hadn't been there before. He read about Jordan, 7 years old, had started sleeping with the light on. Ethan sat with that detail for a long time. 7 years old, sleeping with the light on. He looked at his phone. Danielle had sent him a message an hour ago. Something light. Something about the seating arrangement for the rehearsal dinner. Something that had the texture of a woman who was thinking entirely about tomorrow and not at all about what she had left behind to get there. He set the phone face down. He didn't sleep much that night. By morning, the decision had made itself somewhere below the level of conscious choice. The way certain decisions do when you have been honest with yourself about what you are looking at and what it means. He was not going to cancel quietly. He had thought about it. The clean version. A phone call, a returned ring, a brief and private ending before the guests arrived. He could give her that. He could protect her from the public part of this and simply remove himself from the equation. But something stopped him. Not cruelty. Not a desire to punish her in front of an audience. Something quieter than that. He had spent months building something with this woman. He had introduced her to his family, his circle, his world. People had invested in this wedding, emotionally, logistically, financially. His mother had cried when he told her he was getting married. His sister had flown in from London. His oldest friend had rearranged a business trip to be there. And all of that had been built on a version of Danielle that was, at its foundation, incomplete. Not wrong in every detail, but incomplete in the specific way that changes everything. The way a building looks perfectly sound until you find out the load-bearing wall isn't where the blueprints said it was. He thought about what it meant that she had never told him. Not once. Not in the way that you gradually reveal the harder parts of yourself to someone you're building a life with. Not in a quiet moment of honesty. Not in a fight. Not even in the abstract. I wasn't the best version of myself in my marriage. The kind of partial disclosure people use when they're acknowledging something without exposing it fully. Nothing. She had looked at him, across months of conversations, across evenings that were supposed to be about knowing each other, and she had kept this in a locked room that she had given him no key to, and no indication even existed. He wasn't ending this because she had left her marriage. People left marriages. That was not his judgment to make. He was ending this because she had looked him in the eye repeatedly and let him build on sand, because there were 2 children sleeping in a house somewhere in this city who had a mother getting married tomorrow and didn't know about it. Because if she could erase that, carry it so lightly that it never surfaced in any of the conversations they'd had, then he didn't know her. And he had been about to stand in front of everyone he loved and promise to spend his life next to someone he didn't know. He wanted them to know that too, not as punishment, as truth. The morning of the wedding was beautiful in the particular way that April mornings in Texas sometimes are, before the heat settles in. When the air is still mild and the light is angled soft and the world looks like it's holding still for you. The estate looked extraordinary. The magnolias were blooming. The chapel doors were propped open and the light inside fell through the old windows in wide amber bars across the white chairs and white ribbon and white flowers that filled every visible surface. Guests arrived looking the way guests arrive at a wedding they are excited about. Animated, dressed up, carrying the particular energy of people who have been looking forward to something. There were embraces in the parking area, photographs on the chapel steps, children in miniature formal wear running between the adults' legs. And the bridesmaids moved through the morning with the controlled chaos that characterizes the hour before a ceremony. Irons and touch-up kits and glasses of champagne and someone's shoes that had been packed in the wrong bag. Danielle's mother cried getting her into the dress. Her best friend held her face in both hands and told her she had never looked more like herself. Danielle believed her. She stood in the anteroom off the main chapel with her bouquet in both hands and let herself feel it, the full weight of the moment, the culmination of everything she had decided and done and sacrificed, and walked toward. This was it. She had done it. Not easily, not without cost, but it was here, tangible, real, witnessed. The life she had imagined from the outside was about to become the life she lived from the inside. The music started. On she exhaled, the doors opened, and Danielle Carter walked down that aisle for the last time. The guests rose. the way they always do, that slow, reverent standing that marks the arrival of the bride as something worth interrupting everything else for. She saw faces she recognized and faces she didn't, all of them turned toward her, all of them carrying the expression people wear when they are watching something they consider beautiful. She walked toward Ethan. He was already at the altar, standing very still in his dark suit, hands clasped in front of him, watching her come down the aisle with an expression she read from that distance as calm. That calmed her. She had been more afraid than she had admitted to anyone, that he would look nervous, that something in his eyes would tell her he was having doubts, that the specific kind of presentiment she had been pushing down for weeks would find some confirmation in his face at the moment she needed him to just be solid. But he looked solid. He looked like a man who had made his decision. She didn't know how right she was. She reached the altar. He took her hands. His hands were warm and dry and steady. She looked up at him and smiled the smile she had practiced in her head for months. Open, certain, without apology. He looked at her, not with warmth exactly, not with coldness either, with something she couldn't name. The officiant began. He spoke about the weight of commitment, about the way love asks us to be known, truly known, by another person, about the choice made not just on the wedding day but every day afterward. Get to turn towards someone else's reality and let it matter to you. He spoke about truth as the ground beneath every lasting thing. Danielle listened and felt the words settling into her like something good. Then it was time for the vows. The officiant invited Ethan to begin. Ethan looked at Danielle for a long moment. Then he turned, slightly, measuredly, to face the room. A small movement, the kind that changes everything. "Before we continue," he said, "there's something I need to say." His voice was the same voice it always was, controlled, even, the voice of a man who had decided what he was going to say and was now simply saying it. The room did something rooms do when the air pressure changes. Everyone shifted almost imperceptibly. The way people do when the part of their brain that reads danger signals sends a message they haven't consciously received yet. Chairs creaked. The soft rustling went quiet. Danielle's hands tightened around her bouquet. Ethan spoke. He spoke about the experience of meeting someone who seemed to be everything they presented themselves to be. He spoke about the particular kind of investment you make when you are building something serious, not just time and money, but the exposure of your own history, your own family, your own private self, offered up as proof that you are willing to be known. He spoke about what you owe each other in that process, in terms of honesty, about what it means when that honesty is withheld. And then he said her name, and he turned the page. And here he told them about the husband she had left, a man he described, simply and without editorial, as a man who had been faithful and present, who had been blindsided, who was now raising their children alone. He told them about the children, their names, their ages, the fact that neither of them had been told their mother was getting married today. The room took that the way rooms take something that changes the meaning of everything that came before it. In stages. First silence. Then a sound that wasn't quite words. Breath released, chairs shifted. The first of what would become a series of whispers spreading in low waves from front to back, like water finding level. Danielle stood absolutely still. She was aware of her hands. She was aware of the bouquet shaking slightly. Thus, she was aware of the faces turning toward her. The same faces that had watched her walk in with admiration, now reorganizing themselves into something different. She was aware of the heat in her cheeks and the specific airless quality of the moment, the way time had slowed to a speed where every second was fully visible. Ethan. Her voice came out in almost nothing, a whisper that barely made it across the space between them. Please. He looked at her, and she saw something in his face she had not expected. Not anger, not contempt, not even coldness. Something closer to grief, like a man who had genuinely wanted this to be different and was having to accept that it wasn't. "I spent a long time last night," he said. quietly enough that the front rows heard clearly and the rest of the room had to strain for it. I'm trying to understand how someone could do what you did, not leave a marriage. I understand that things end, but leave the way you left, and then sit across from me for months and never say a word. The room was so quiet. I kept asking myself, would you have told me? At any point. Was there a version of this where you brought it to me yourself and gave me the chance to decide what I wanted to do with it? He paused. I don't think there was. He released her hands. She hadn't realized until that moment that he had been holding them the whole time. I can't marry you, he said. The words were not loud. They didn't need to be. He stepped back, looked at her one last time with that expression that wasn't quite anything she had a clean word for. And then he turned, and he walked. Not fast. Not with the energy of someone escaping, just walking. Measured, certain. Back up the aisle he had come down. The doors closed behind him, and Danielle stood at the altar, alone. For a moment that lasted longer than any moment she had experienced in her adult life, she simply stood, her bouquet in her hands, the amber light still falling through the old windows, the magnolias still visible through the chapel doors, the guests still seated, as if nobody could quite commit yet to the act of leaving. And then someone stood up. And then someone else. And the sound of people gathering their things, careful, quiet, the specific discretion people exercise when they are witnessing someone's worst moment and want to give it the minimum amount of additional weight, filled the room and moved toward the doors. Nobody said anything to her. A few people looked. Most didn't. Her best friend appeared at her elbow, said her name, touched her arm. Danielle heard her from a distance, like sound coming through water. The venue that had been beautiful an hour ago was now just a room with too many flowers in it. She stood in it until it was almost empty. And then she let herself be guided out. The weeks that followed had the particular texture of a collapse that happens too slowly. Not a sudden fall, but a gradual emptying. The way air goes out of something that has been punctured without your noticing. Until one day the shape is wrong and you understand that something essential is gone. Ethan had been clear and had been final. There were logistics, the returning of things, the disentangling of the small infrastructure of a shared life that had been anticipating permanence, and he handled all of it through intermediaries with courtesy and without contact. He did not explain himself further. He did not respond to her messages, the ones she sent in the first week, first with explanations, then with apologies, then with something rawer than both of those that she would later be glad he hadn't replied to. He was done. And in being done so completely, so clearly, he removed the possibility of the negotiation she might have otherwise used to avoid sitting with what she had actually done. She went to stay with her mother in Beaumont, and it was there, in her childhood bedroom, in the particular silence of being 38 years old and sleeping in a twin bed under a ceiling fan that still made the same clicking sound it had made when she was 12. It was there that everything she had managed not to look at directly began to demand her full attention. She thought about Imani. She thought about Jordan. She thought about the drawing in the box she hadn't opened. She thought about Marcus's face on that Tuesday evening. How long he had sat there, how slowly he had asked about the kids, how he had not said a single cruel thing, even though he had every available right to. She thought about the specific mechanism by which she had gotten from there to here. Not the broad strokes, those she had been telling herself for 2 years, but the specific choices. The specific moments when she had prioritized her own comfort over someone else's need. The specific lies, large and small, including the ones that were lies only by omission, only by the deliberate withholding of truth from someone who had trusted her enough to ask for it. She thought about Ethan's question, "Would you have told me?" She didn't answer it in her mother's house. She sat with it instead, that question and its honest answer, in a way she hadn't allowed herself to sit with anything in a very long time. Because that was the real question beneath all of it. Not whether the marriage had been working, not whether she deserved more, not whether love could run out and leave two people sitting in the same house with nothing left to share. Those were real questions too. but they weren't the one that cut closest. The one that cut closest was this. What kind of person keeps a secret that size from someone who is handing them their whole life? What does it say about who you are? And the follow-up, harder still. What do you do with that? When you can't give back what you took and you can't undo what you did, what do you do with the shape of who you turned out to be? Danielle didn't have answers to those questions in the weeks after the wedding, but for the first time in a very long time, she was actually asking them. Marcus, meanwhile, had not stayed broken. This is the part people don't always anticipate when they imagine someone being left behind. That some people, given no other option, find something in themselves that the comfort of a functioning marriage might never have required. Marcus had cried. He had gone through the phases that loss puts you through, and he had done it largely alone and largely at night after the kids were asleep, because he had made a decision early on that whatever was happening to him as a person was not going to be the thing his children woke up to every morning. He had gotten them to school. He had learned to braid Imani's hair, badly at first, and then less badly, with the help of a YouTube channel he would never have told anyone about, but that Imani called Daddy's Tutorials, with the private pride of a child who knows she helped her parent learn something new. He had started running, not for any particular reason, except that at a certain point he needed somewhere to put what was in him, and the pre-dawn miles before the kids woke up turned out to be it. And here he had let people help him when they offered. His mother, a neighbour who started bringing food twice a week and never made it strange, a couple of friends from work who had shown up on a Saturday with no particular agenda and spent the afternoon just being present in his house. He had started going to therapy, quietly, without announcing it. Just sat in an office every other Thursday and let himself be honest about what he was carrying and what he was afraid of and what kind of father and person he wanted to be when he was done being afraid. He had not moved on romantically. That part of himself felt very far away, and he was honest with himself about not being ready for it, and he didn't force it. But he had moved forward. He was different than the man Danielle had left. Not just sadder, but more deliberately considered. Like someone who had been taken apart and had to decide piece by piece what to put back and what to leave out. His kids were okay, not undamaged. Imani's watchfulness and Jordan's light being a testament to the fact that children absorb the things we think we're hiding from them. But okay, loved, held, moving through their days with a father who had decided that showing up completely was the thing he had to offer, and so that was what he was going to give. He found out about the wedding the way people find out things in the age of social media and interconnected social circles, through someone who had been there, who had told someone else, who had eventually told someone who knew him. He sat with the information for a long time. He felt things he hadn't expected to feel, not satisfaction, and not the particular cold comfort of someone else's downfall, but something more complicated than that. Something closer to the feeling you have when a story you've been waiting to understand finally gives you its last piece, and the picture that forms is not the vindication you imagined, but something that makes you mostly just tired and a little sad. He thought about Danielle standing at that altar. He thought about the kids. He did not contact her. He didn't have anything left to say. He made dinner that night, something he'd been learning to make from a recipe Imani had picked out, something more complicated than he would have attempted a year ago, that required more steps than felt practical. That he made anyway because she had asked for it, and because the act of making it with her standing on a step stool beside him asking questions about what everything was, that act felt like exactly where he was supposed to be. It wasn't the life they had planned in that first apartment, but it was something real. And real, he had come to understand, was not nothing. Danielle called her children from her mother's house on a Wednesday afternoon. It was the first call where she didn't have a script for herself, where she didn't know ahead of time what shape the conversation would take or what version of herself she was going to present. Imani answered, "Hi, Mum." 2 words. carrying everything. Danielle said hello, said she was thinking about them, said she wanted to talk, really talk, in a way that wasn't just a check-in. Imani was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Okay, just that, okay." And Danielle, for the first time in the longest time, stopped performing and started listening. It was not a resolution. It was not a reunion. It was not the beginning of anything she could have predicted or planned. It was just a Wednesday phone call. But it was real. And sometimes real is exactly where you have to start. Because here is the truth that Danielle's story is holding. Underneath all the drama and the public collapse and the carefully constructed life that came apart at its own altar, you can want more than you have and be absolutely justified in that wanting. You can feel invisible in a life that wasn't designed for you and be completely correct in needing out of it. But wanting more doesn't mean you take it at any cost. And it doesn't mean the people in your path when you decided to run don't count. It doesn't mean you get to build a new identity on top of an old truth and pretend the two things don't share the same foundation. Some choices compound. They build on each other until the structure is too far from honest ground to stand, and the only way back is not through another escape. It's through. Not comfortable, not clean, not fast, but through. Danielle had run for 2 years. For the first time, she was standing still. Now, here's the question that will follow you after this story ends, the one that doesn't have a clean answer no matter how long you sit with it. If Ethan had never hired that investigator, if that file had never existed, if nothing had ever surfaced, would she have told him? On their wedding night, or the first anniversary, or 10 years in, sitting across from him at a kitchen table in the house that was supposed to be theirs, watching their life together become something layered and real. Would there have been a moment where she looked at him and said, "There is something I need you to know about me"? Or would she have carried it forever, taken it all the way through, built the whole thing on top of it, smiled in every photograph and clinked every glass and renewed every vow while beneath all of it, running quiet and continuous, was the life she had chosen to erase? Because that might be the part of this story that is actually about you, not Danielle's choices, not Ethan's method, not Marcus's survival, but that question. The thing you are carrying that the person who loves you doesn't know about. The version of yourself you have not offered them. The door in your own story that you walk past every day and keep choosing not to open. We all have one. The question is what you decide to do with it. And if you think this is where the story ends, it isn't. Because what Danielle did next, what Marcus said when he found out what had happened to her, and what Imani did 6 months later that nobody but, not Marcus, not Danielle, not anyone who was in that church, saw coming. That's where this story takes a turn nobody saw coming.